want to thank everyone for joining me for this Beth Israel members event. And one of the reasons we kept it to members is because I know that there are a lot of ways to get information on this topic, and I wanted to provide a way for our members to engage with a friend of the congregation. We have many brilliant people in the congregation and who are friends of the congregation to help us understand complex issues, and I'm glad to be able to call upon Matthew Shugart once again. It's my honor to, on such momentous events happening all around us, to introduce Professor Matthew Shugart.
All right, thank you. And I have to ask the obligatory, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we do. And
okay,
if
good.
you start to fade, I'll let you know.
Yeah, okay. Well, I am a retired now professor of political science, and for many years I was at UC San Diego, which is how Rob Nadav and I have a connection. And for the last 10 years, I've been at UC Davis, although, like I said, I retired in 2013. My specialty is comparative democracy, particularly, let's say, democratic institutions, like the structure or the kind of the bones of democracy. And since I happen to keep them always within my reach, I mean, so one of my books, this is from 2000, I don't even remember, 2014, A Different Democracy. We compare the different democracy reference here is the US. Anyway, the book is about how unusual the US is in comparative perspective. And one of the cases we use is Israel. I wouldn't call myself an expert on Israeli politics, but I'm oh, wow. I'm honored. Rob Mickey says, I've taught that book. Thank you so much. I wouldn't call myself an expert on Israeli politics per se. I would call myself an expert on political institutions. But Israel is one of the countries I follow most closely for personal interest. But I've also published, maybe I'm being too modest, I've published several things on Israeli politics. I've got the chapter on the electoral system in the Oxford Handbook of Israeli Politics and Society, so that's kind of a big thing. And I taught Israeli politics at UC Davis several times over the last several years. So that's where I'm coming from. And so rather than talk any more about myself, you see, I always blush a bit when I talk about myself or when people tell me that they're using my books. So I do, try to stay a little bit modest about these things. But here we go. I'm going to tell you what I think is going on, how it compares, and try to situate it in like the perspective of the last several years of trends in Israeli party politics. So to start with, I just want to describe the goals of the reform, or the judicial overhaul, as it's often being called. I'm sure anyone who's tuning in here knows, basically what's going on, but just so that we're on the same page, so to speak. One of the most important aspects of it is to give the Knesset majority, and therefore the coalition government, control over appointments to the Supreme Court and other courts in the Israeli judicial system. To require, that's one thing, to require a supermajority of the Supreme Court to declare any legislative act contrary to the Constitution of Israel, and to allow a Knesset majority, 61 of the 120 elected members of the Knesset, to override Supreme Court declarations. So that's three pillars: appointments, right to declare legislative acts as invalid, and right to override, from the right up to the legislature to override any such declarations that they nonetheless still declare. So, of course, this prompted mass demonstrations, I mean, on a truly vast scale, not only by Israeli standards, but perhaps no democracy has experienced protests on this large a scale. The only rival I can think of is, and I'm not an expert on protests, but I've consulted with a few people, and it seems like the only one that's a clear rival was South Korea. Had some huge protests over attempting to get, and successfully getting, a president impeached in 2016-17. Something like 3 to 5% of the Israeli population has been on the streets at any one time, which is actually really huge. a US equivalent would be like over 8 million people. Can you imagine 8 million Americans being out in the streets at any one time protesting something, some act of the government? No, I can't. So what's the context in which all this is happening? I need to act like a political science professor for a moment. Okay, for several moments, that's what I am, right? So talk a little bit about Israeli political institutions. So it's a parliamentary democracy with a single chamber, no upper house. That chamber is elected by proportional representation. It's a unitary system, meaning there are no regional governments like state governments or provincial governments. So by parliamentary, of course, we mean the head of government and cabinet rests on the legislative majority. And by proportional representation, we simply mean that the legislature is elected to ensure that each political party has a share of seats that's about equal to its share of the votes. There's a president, totally ceremonial. Isaac Herzog has attempted to mediate in this and is still attempting to mediate. He has no authority to enforce anything or to veto anything. This is not an unusual combination. Parliamentary, proportional representation, unicameral. There are lots of democracies that have this combination or something very similar to it. Israel's is a bit extreme in ways I'll get to, but it's not rare. And many political scientists, myself included, would say that this is basically, if there's any such thing as a best model of democracy, this is pretty much it. PR parliamentary, you'll get some mix of opinions on whether federalism is good or not, but most people would say a country as small as Israel doesn't really need federalism. So, this is a good model. Several successful long-term democracies fit this general model. I would say Denmark, Sweden, Norway, New Zealand. Several others come close. They might have a weak upper house. They might have a weak president who's elected rather than appointed, elected by the people rather than elected by the legislature like Israel's is. There are examples of it, Portugal, Finland. There are federal parliamentary cases like Canada, Australia, and Germany that are not that different from this model. So again, it's not, there's nothing unusual about this. Moreover, all democracies have Supreme Courts or something similar. Some of them have a separate body called the Constitutional Court. Sometimes those are combined, as they are in Israel and the US, constitutional and regular courts being in one, the apex being at one Supreme Court. But not all democracies empower their courts to overturn legislation. So some of the defenders of the judicial overhaul say, well, this wouldn't be that unusual if we told the court that it can't overturn legislative acts, because there are plenty of democracies where that's the case. And that is true. That is a true statement. For example, in the Netherlands, there's no judicial review on constitutional matters. They can't overturn legislation. In Switzerland, there's not, although Switzerland has all sorts of other minority protection devices built into its system. So Israel fits like what many of us would call a normatively desirable and empirically successful model of democracy. And it still would. This is something I want to say that I think gets lost too often. It would still fit this model even if the court couldn't claim that there's a higher law than any given piece of legislation that the Knesset has passed. It would still conform to that good model of democracy. But it's highly anomalous in various other ways. And that's where we get to the interesting things and the things that have provoked such justified, in my view, concern that led to these huge protests. What is the Constitution of Israel? That sounds like a trick question. Shouldn't I be able to just pull it off the shelf and open it up and there's the Constitution and I see the powers of all the different aspects of government and the rights of the citizens and all the things that constitutions normally cover? Well, no. The Constitution of Israel is whatever a majority of the Knesset says. There's no single document called the Constitution. I'm sure everybody knows this. If you didn't know it before the recent protests, you certainly know it now because this has been mentioned so many times. There's no document that's ever been enacted by the Knesset or a constitutional convention or something like that, that stipulates that it is higher law than just a regular statute passed by the legislature. There's no such document. A related anomaly that's absolutely central to these events is that the Supreme Court itself declared in the 1990s that it had the authority to overturn legislation on the grounds that the Knesset had passed a set of other laws that they called basic laws, and that those were the Constitution. And so therefore, if the Knesset has passed a law and we, the Supreme Court, a majority of the Supreme Court, decide that it contradicts the basic law, we can invalidate that legislation. That's not in the basic law, that the basic law in the judiciary. It doesn't say that the judiciary can do this. The judiciary asserted in the mid-1990s in a series of cases when Aharon Barak was the president of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, that because there are basic laws, it must be that we have the authority to interpret what contradicts them. So in effect, the Supreme Court declared that Israel had a constitution and that it was the guardian of it. So I want to say that the political right in Israel has a point when it says that the court has usurped legislative sovereignty in a way that it had no authority to do. People on the right will use the phrase, we vote right, we get left. It's a common criticism. They claim that, so since 1977, most elections, a few exceptions, but most elections have returned a right-wing majority. But the court has periodically invalidated legislation passed by those governments. And of course, the right says, well, look, we're still getting left-wing policy. That is, the court is upholding a status quo or that the legislative majority is trying to change, or the legislative majority is enacting legislation that the court says violates a basic law. So, I mean, they have a point. Of course, it's one thing to have a point, and it's another thing to take a kind of blunderbuss approach that they're taking. And that's what I'm just trying to set the parameters here. I want to, if I'm allowed, yeah, I'm allowed. Okay. I'm going to quickly, I've only got a couple of slides that I think will help with a few specific points. So, whoops, that's not the one I wanted to show. I'm trying to show you that one. The basic law in the judiciary establishes an appointment process, an appointment commission, judicial selection committee, that consists of 9 members. This is how members of the Supreme Court and other courts are actually appointed in Israel. This commission, which if you read in B, it's there. What you get is there 3 members. 3 of the members of this committee are members of the Supreme Court itself. 2 are government ministers, and 2 are other politicians from the legislature who could be from the coalition, but often one is from the opposition and one is from the coalition, and 2 from the Bar Association. And 2, although it's not clear from this excerpt that I gave you, to appoint a Supreme Court justice requires 7 of the 9 to consent. So the right has made several disingenuous claims about the procedure, implying that the court basically perpetuates itself. I've heard that over and over. We have a self-perpetuating court. The court decides who's on the court, and therefore we can never have a court that respects the democratic will of the citizens, which they would say is us, right? We're in the majority. We've got a right-wing government. We're the majority. The court doesn't respect that. It just perpetuates itself. It's disingenuous, especially when they go so far as to say judicial dictatorship. I'm trying to close this, and my cursor doesn't seem to be finding it. There we go. No, there we go. Okay. They say the judiciary has a veto on appointments, which might be technically true if you work through it, like how do you get 7 votes? You're going to have to include some of the Supreme Court members as well. But the point is, you also have to include politicians. They both have a veto. So it's a process that encourages a consensus. I'm going to say that I would love to take this model and import it. A model that allows professional judges and politicians to jointly decide who's on the court rather than just letting politicians do it. But the Israeli right is trying to make it so that the politicians, not just any politicians, but the government selected members will have a majority. The right says that numerous other democracies give the legislature or the cabinet the final say about who sits on the court. It's actually only kind of like technically true. In fact, I think the vast majority of democracies involve their judiciary some way in appointing who sits on the judiciary. Why would they do that? Even if it's sort of like not written in law somewhere, they do it in practice. Canada, Germany, New Zealand, Australia, a whole host of Japan, a whole host of democracies have judicial councils or judicial selection committees on which judges themselves are the dominant factor. And the legislature just ratifies the selection proposed by this commission, or this judicial council, it's sometimes called. So actually what Israel has currently is more politicized than what many other parliamentary systems have, because in most democracies, the US is not one of these cases, right? But in most democracies, politicians have recognized that they should restrain themselves for who goes on the court. They shouldn't appoint their people. They should have professional judges. And who's better to determine who's qualified than other judges? So the right is making, in Israel, is making it sound like this is just like some crazy idea that Israel has had all these years and that it shouldn't ever be allowed in a democracy. Kind of not really right. So if this passed, would this be the end of democracy? So here I've been kind of, pushing back against the right. I'm going to push back against the left and the center left a little bit. No, it wouldn't. I don't think so. And here's the reason why. The normative argument I mentioned earlier, that many political scientists, including myself, hold that coalition-based parliamentary democracies. There's parliamentary democracies where you elect the legislature by proportional representation, meaning it's unlikely that any one party has a majority, and they have to build coalitions, that's actually the best protection for minorities that you can get. Here's the like one sentence version of the logic. Coalitions shift over time. So if you have a fluid system with lots of parties coming and going in the system, and vote shifts over time, and disputes that cause parties in coalition to break apart and find other allies, that's what protects against tyranny of the majority, is that the majority itself shifts, not from like just one party to another party, because then you can be like one tyranny and then another tyranny, but it shifts from one set of parties to another set of parties, which may include some of the ones in the first set, and then it shifts again to another set. And that's, in fact, the way Israeli politics has generally worked, is one party might be dominant for a while. It used to be Labor, recently it's been Likud, but the partners shift regularly. And so having a majority choose the court is not the same thing as, it's almost like the left really believes the right's argument that they'll never win an election again. And I guess I wouldn't really believe that. So I'm going to try to wrap this up in the next 7 minutes or so. I know there's ticking.
Matthew, you're doing great. I can't believe how well you are, so succinct. So just keep going.
I've never thought of myself that way, but okay. Thank you. I'm going to show the other slide, which you accidentally got a sneak preview of a moment ago because of my inability to share a screen properly, I guess. It's election results. It's a mess, and which is kind of the point. Okay, so if you look at this, say that's a mess. Yeah, you got the point.
Wait.
There's
Matthew,
really no good.
We're still there. We go. Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. What happened? Let's try that again.
No, we can see it now. The one with the
Yeah, but I'm sorry, but it's not supposed to be doing that. Let's see. Now I think it'll automatically shift, and I hope it'll stay there. Okay, that was bizarre, but
oh, it's probably on play. It's probably on play, and we have to pause it, or maybe you're right. Maybe
I
it's
think
staying.
it'll stay.
Okay, great.
I think it'll stay here now. I don't know. Anyway, it's really hard to present the Israeli parties and elections in any succinct way. And so here I just up four of the recent, there have been 6 elections since 2015, 5 of those since April 2019. Of course, you all know that. Um, and I, anytime you try to group these parties in blocks and in sectors, it's really difficult, but I tried to do it with color coding. I put the center, center, left, and left all in one color because I only have a limited palette of colors to work with, and there are so many different tendencies in the Israeli political system, which again is kind of the point. So if you look at the most recent election, the 2022 November, um, a really extraordinary thing here is that this government does not even rest on a majority of the voters. So we're hearing the right talk regularly about how it represents the will of the electorate. But there are two problems with that. First of all, they didn't campaign saying we're going to drastically overhaul the judicial system. Yeah, lots of politicians in the right have talked about this for years and years. They didn't run on saying this is what we're elect us and this is what we'll do. For logical reasons, they didn't really want to talk about that too much because it would remind people, if you talk about the judiciary, it's always going to remind people of Netanyahu's legal problems. So they didn't really talk about it much during the campaign. But more than that, they didn't even get a majority of the votes. The parties in government have less than half the votes representing them. That's extremely unusual in a PR, proportional representation, parliamentary democracy, right? Proportional representation, by definition, should represent everybody proportionally. And yet here you have government with 64 of the 120 seats, but only 49.5, and that includes that Shaked party, which I put in red up there, which didn't get any seats at all. So we could say their votes, that's already, they're already included in that. Um, and so the other thing that I'm really highlighting here, notice all the places where I put red are things that like you should really trying to call your attention to. In April 2019, there was an election in which the center right got a majority of the votes, but only half the seats and couldn't form a government. The big thing that happened there was the right was split. The right did not present anything close to a coherent front, and the new right party of Bennett and Shaked, Ayelet Shaked, and Naftali Bennett, just missed the threshold. The threshold is 3.25%. They just missed it. So they wasted all those votes. And there's this other right-wing party, the Zehut party by a defector from Likud, which I'll sum up their platform as basically smoke dope and build the third temple now. It's a very interesting party. I'm not making this up either. They wasted some votes. What happens in 2022? The left and the Arab sector waste votes. They split in too many different ways, and Meretz falls below the threshold, just like the new right did in April 2019. And one of the Arab parties, 2.9, falls a little bit below the threshold. So what we look like kind of big shifts are sometimes the result of decisions taken by party leaders who thought they could make it over the threshold on their own, and they decided to not unify with someone else, and they didn't get over. But consistent through most of these elections, the possible exception of 2019 early, that depends on how you code some of these, but the broader right has a majority without these extremists like Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Because I'm counting Gantz as center right. Realistically, he's a center right figure. When he's in alliance with Lapid, okay, I can't count it that way because Lapid is certainly center left, center, whatever you want to call him. But he's not a right wing politician. But Gantz really is. You can't run your first campaign introducing. I mean, everyone knew he was. He'd been chief of staff, but introducing yourself as a prime ministerial candidate. You run your first campaign showing the smoldering ruins of part of Gaza City and basically saying, I did this. You know, he was running, claiming credit for how tough he was, right? You can't run like that and not be called a right-wing politician. So I'm calling him one. And you could build a majority from a set of center-right and right-wing parties that leaves out the ultranationalists like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Why? That's there. Why doesn't it happen? Because Bibi Netanyahu, right? I'm an institutionalist. I'm not supposed to say things can come down to individuals, but in this case, there's no question, right? Netanyahu has spent the last all the way back to like 2018 under corruption investigation and on trial more recently, and alienating allies from across the spectrum. He's kind of made himself a position where he has no other allies to turn to besides, of course, the Haredi, who are always his natural allies, and then Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who jointly got not even 11% of the vote, but arguably have a lot more than, certainly have really important positions in this government and have really, really radical, radical isn't even the word, but just extremist positions. I don't think that really is a stable thing. I don't think they're going to build on that and do better in future elections. I think there's still a place for a moderate right, moderate's the wrong word. People like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and other politicians that I won't name have kind of made us think that anyone who's not a raving extremist is a moderate. I wouldn't call Shugart and Bennett moderates. They're not like tear down everything kinds of right wingers. That portion of the electorate that was represented by Bennett and Shugart had just missed that threshold in April 2019. It would have been a very different past 4 years in Israel if they had cleared it. They then went into government. The stars in the table show the governments, and so Bennett went into that government with left wing and an Arab party. He killed his party by doing that, sadly. I mean, I think he did a pretty heroic thing there to form a government that was a broad spectrum without Netanyahu, but he killed his party. He retired from politics at least temporarily, and Shugart got 1.2% of the vote trying to carry on the party. Voters who wanted a right-wing option to the right of Likud had nowhere else to go. Well, even whether they liked Smotrich or Ben-Gvir, that was the option available to them. So anyway, I'm trying to end on a somewhat optimistic note, but I'm not quite coming out that way. But the point being that there's clearly a majority that would be center-right, center-right, whatever you'd want to call it, without the extreme right. And I believe it would reassert itself if Netanyahu were either to be exonerated or convicted or somehow resign. But the Israeli political system is right now just in a difficult state where it's stuck with Netanyahu, and it's therefore stuck with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And these folks all have this agenda where they think that the court has been left wing all these years, and now is our one time to change it. I think maybe I'll stop my statements there and let people ask questions, because I've said a lot, and I've probably confused everybody, because I'm good at that.
Matthew, why don't you go ahead and stop sharing your screen, even though that,
yeah,
I'm so glad I've sort of memorized that. If people have
right.
What I'd like to try, and I know that there's no perfect way to have a Zoom meeting with 77 people, but just because it's such an emotional topic, let's try a moderated system where people put questions in the chat, and I also pick a few of them to highlight. And of course, Matthew, depending on how agile you are with all of this, you can choose. I'm going to start off with two questions I've written down, but I'm also going to go. I see Alon just pop something in there, and I'm going to check that out too. But so Matthew, you said that coalitions can shift, and it made
Yeah,
me feel better. I mean, you're alleviating some of the strain of what we're watching. So you're like, look,
yeah,
in a democracy, coalitions can shift very quickly, and if the power is given to the majority, then that majority can change. So my question is, then what does the present coalition think they are accomplishing by making this? I mean, is it just revenge for, putting Netanyahu on trial, or do they, is there some kind of, is there a long-term reform? Is there a long-term benefit to this reform that they see? And I'm just going to throw out another question, at the same time, which is whether ha, there was a part of me that was wondering whether Israeli demographics have been coming home to roost, meaning that 20 years ago, when people like I and many others lived in Israel, sometimes for years at a time, we watched people in Tel Aviv have 1.5 children, and we watched settlers and Haredim have 12 to 15, and we knew that someday that was going to have an impact on coalitions and electorates. Is it, or do you see? Because when you said this, the Smotrich, they got less than 11%. I mean, it's not like it's not like 55% of the country is supporting this. So I was wondering whether there is a demographic shift or whether that's not so salient. So what do they think they're accomplishing, and how much demographics and in a sense the winds of history play a part in this?
yeah. So those are both really great questions. So the first one just kind of nails it. Like, if 61 votes can decide that the government gets to appoint the court, and that the court and gets to override the court, 61 votes could take that back. They're not searching for consensus here, because they know they could never get a consensus on something this drastic. They could get consensus on something that would tweak the process somewhat, but they don't want to tweak the process. They want to reclaim power, but the point is they can't reclaim power, because they have to keep winning elections. But if I've seen the polling that's come out just this week, since Netanyahu fired the defense minister, and that provoked these even bigger demonstrations, calls for general strikes, and so on. And finally, he said, "Okay, we'll pause," whatever that means. Likud is now currently polling at only 25 seats. They got 32 in the last election. That's a huge shift in Israeli public opinion. And Gantz's party is polling at like 22 or 23, and Lapid's is polling at 22 or 23. So if an election were called now, of course there won't be one, but if there were an election now, Likud would probably find itself out, not probably, find itself out of power. There'd be a majority around Gantz, Lapid, the left parties. And you might not even need the Ram party from the Arab sector that was in Bennett and Lapid's previous government, but maybe you would. But I mean, that's okay. That would be a good thing. Well, okay, normative point. That would be a good thing. It was a good thing when it happened. It would be a good thing if it happened again, but it may not even be necessary. So I don't know. I mean, the right has played a really bad hand here, and I don't completely understand it, except they've wanted to do, certain sectors of it have wanted to do this for a long time. They seem to think this is their moment. And I'm saying that I don't think it is their moment. Somehow this is going to fail. They'll pass it, but it won't last. It'll get overturned, or they will fail to pass it. My guess is the main reason Netanyahu paused it was he no longer had the votes. I think the key was always, would there be members of Likud who would go to him and say, "We're not going to vote for this"? I'm sure. My guess is that's what happened. He was willing to face down a general strike. I'm pretty sure. He was willing to, do whatever it would take if he had the votes. I'm guessing he just didn't have the votes anymore. Once Gallant made his, I'm going to say, very sincere and very heroic statement, I think Likud probably couldn't deliver the votes anymore. So the demographic trend, I mean, obviously, over a long period of time, that's exactly what's happening, right? The Haredi sector is growing. The Mizrahi, which tends to vote for the right, is growing. But then we still see these short-term shifts in election results, like where the religious Zionists go from 5% in one election to 11% in the other. Why is that? It's because the less extreme right, but still right of Likud, in other words, Bennett and Shaked, disappeared, in one election, basically punishing them for going into coalition with the left. So making long-term projections is always extremely dangerous. I mean, yeah, the Haredi sector is certainly going to get bigger, but yeah, I don't know. I'm not
No,
really answering your question, but
no,
the
no, no, no.
demographics are a huge part of this. I mean, they're a very huge part of it because almost everybody in Israel. This is it's huge. I'm over generalizing, but most voters in Israel vote with the group they belong to, rather than just like, well, what party do I think has the nicest platform? They don't vote. They don't vote. Most people don't vote that way. They vote, what's the party that represents my community? So if the communities shift in size over time, that has profound impact on the political outcomes.
So I'm going to pick up on that. I just think people are so articulate in the chat area. I don't need to read them unless it helps you.
Oh,
But no. But I'm happy to read them because they're really easy to read. I don't have to
okay,
summarize them.
okay,
But two
okay.
people. I'm going to go more or less in order. But two people have mentioned, picking up on the demographic issue, Mizrahi Sephardi versus Ashkenazim. That Supreme Court has been maybe not Supreme Court. Pardon me. Of the justices, they've been maybe almost exclusively Ashkenazic, and that there's when you said that people vote how they I'm talking about settlers and Haredim, but there's another ethnic identity issue going on here. I was wondering if you could comment on how that's playing a role here.
I did look at the current roster of Supreme Court justices, and I mean there's one Arab member. There are two or three. There are 15 total. There are maybe two or three who are almost certainly Mizrahi. There might be others who are. I'm making generalizations from bios and pictures. And, I mean that's really bad practice. But some of them say, talk about organizations they were involved with, which gives cues to what their identity might be. So I mean, there's certainly an Ashkenazi majority, and the establishment, the judicial establishment, is more favorable to. I mean, this is a common refrain. It's not me saying it, but it's on balance more favorable to an Ashkenazi sort of worldview. And so, I mean, again, the right kind of has the right, which is more likely, is the part of the political spectrum that the Mizrahi are more likely to vote for. The right has a point that the court could be more representative. I think that's probably true.
Thanks.
And do you get that with their reforms? Maybe, but they're also going to clearly impose an ideological litmus test.
So the next question comes from Mark Daskin, but actually was very much on my mind, which is about the protesters. In my shorthand, it would be, what do the protesters think they're protesting? Is it judicial reform? Is it anti-Bibi?
Yeah.
Like, what is it? And I think Mark said it well. So he said, you have focused on the court, but many commentators have suggested that the current protests are really about the heart of Israel. How it treats the ultra-Orthodox, how it treats Israeli Arabs, Palestinians, academics. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I knew somehow that would come up in the Q&A, so I decided to postpone it for now. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'd love to think as a political scientist that people really get agitated by things like what's the structure of the Judicial Selection Committee and what's the number of votes needed to override. And, I mean, because I get pretty excited about stuff like that, but you don't get hundreds of thousands of people on the streets over stuff like that, right? It's all about policy and power all the way down, right? I mean, that's what people are concerned about. And yes, why do the parties on the right and why do the Haredi parties want these changes in the judicial system? It's because they don't trust. Well, for the Haredi, the obvious answer, I think, is they want an override clause because they think even if there were more conservative justices, they wouldn't be their kind of conservative. They wouldn't be sympathetic to a Haredi worldview. They want to be able to say, look, we're in the coalition and we can tell you we're bringing down the government if you don't ensure that we can maintain gender segregation at municipal sponsored events that in our towns. in other words, with public support, or you're not going to let us pass a law so we can prevent chametz from being brought into the hospitals during Pesach. I mean, right? Courts will the court they can't trust secular courts, so but they can trust a coalition government that they are pivotal to. And so if you're in the secular, whether that's a majority or not, I mean, it depends on how you define things and how people self-define. But if you're in the large block of a country that is secular, or even those who might be religious but not Haredi, you know, you you know you it's easy to see why people might think that this is just a stepping stone towards giving the Haredi even more control over society than they already are perceived to have. So yeah, it's about much bigger issues.
Can I ask you just, I'm quoting several, Rebecca Canner and Beth Dwoskin, among others in the chat, which is that, okay, if the Haredi, and if I misunderstand you, which I probably do, you can always tell me. If the Haredim are like, look, we're one or two issue, like it wouldn't matter if you gave us everything if tomorrow that you let chametz in the hospital, but
Yeah.
how about the people who are there decisions being made by the Supreme Court that this reform was a statement about, either decisions about settlements or decisions about the occupation, or it's really the same thing, or decisions about LGBTQ? Aren't there decisions being made
Yeah.
that even if all of this is reversed by the next majority, that they're making a statement about, and that some of us might be missing?
Yeah, I think, well, especially for the Haredi, it's there's a whole set of decisions that have been based on the basic law on human dignity is the name of it. It was passed in 1992, I think. And it doesn't have the word equality in it, but it says that no law can infringe the dignity of the person and the privacy of the person. And so the court has used that to say, well, then that means that you can't have gender segregation in publicly funded events. I mean, you can do, privately you can do it, but publicly funded events you can't do it. The Supreme Court has, of course, invalidated several attempts to grant a formalized exemption from IDF service to Haredi. I mean, it's informally that's been done for a long time, but they say you can't put that in law because it violates equality. So I mean, there are a whole host of decisions there that they can point to. Yes, some of the early examples of saying we need to have an ability to override the court has been about decisions regarding Palestinian lands, building of settlements on land where Palestinians had title. The court, I mean the government. Let's get the right institution here. The government often will declare something state land, and therefore, if it's in Area C under the Oslo agreements, you can build on it. The courts have sometimes looked at some cases and said, no, that's actually private land. You can't build on it. Well, if you can override, you can then say, the court has decided incorrectly here, and we can go ahead. So yeah, it's tied up in all the big issues of religion and state and relations with Palestinians.
Well,
I mean, it's very much at the core of why they care about this.
Actually, it's a very helpful answer, because in other words, some of the things I've been reading in chat is like, even if long term this is overturned, I mean, if they can be like, no, now we can build a settlement, or now we can annex this land, I mean, then you've got facts on the ground that even if some structure is changed in the future, short-term gains could be very specific, could be very significant. Both Beth Dwoskin and Rob Mickey and maybe others, because I've been listening even more than I've been reading, have said, look, often these kinds of things, these kinds of reforms actually are meant to politically lock in favor for your party going forward. And we've seen that in democracies. Actually, I shouldn't say this. I think I've seen this in democracies that have become, at least by perception, less democratic, right? They're these little reforms, but what they really do is lock people into power. Is there any aspect to that in this case that you can discern? Providing favoritism for the present coalition going forward?
Well, I mean, the point about the facts on the ground is, of course, a good one. I mean, it's a lot harder to make a ruling that a bunch of apartment buildings have to be torn down than it is to say they can't be built in the first place. So that's a very important point. But otherwise, in general, no, because any 61 vote majority could reverse or amend what they're passing here. I mean, they could, if they could get 70 votes to change the basic law in the judiciary, they could write into that future changes require 70 votes. And that there are some basic laws that have clauses like that, but 61 votes are not going to be allowed to bind 70 votes. I guess they could try it, but I don't think it would hold. I think a future majority would say that majority can't bind us, and I think they'd be right. In the absence of a constitution, it's pretty hard to lock stuff in.
Could they
Again, aside
raise
from things that involve literally building.
could they raise the
Go ahead.
three and a could they raise the 3.5% threshold? Because you pointed out that, I mean, at least in this election, that really did a lot of the liberal parties in.
Yeah, well, it did in
Well,
one
merits.
liberal party, merits, and then one Arab party, which is the Balad is definitely not liberal, but
Sorry.
an
So
Arab party.
actually, my
And
mistake.
it did in the right, the so-called new right in April
That's right.
2019. They should lower it. I mean, that's what I would say. The threshold's too high. I know it sounds low, but it's actually too high. But yeah, it could be raised. Um, yeah, it could be. It's been raised before by a narrow majority. In in 2015, it was still, or before 2015 rather, it was still 2%, and it was raised to try to keep the Arab parties out, which is why they formed the joint list, and then they got 10.5% of the vote and cleared together.
So
So
I'll ask.
yes.
So so if I'm not interrupting, I'm going to ask, I think, one more question, which is this from Leah Kalani, which is, says, do you think Israel is heading in the direction of theocracy? And can I, as the rabbi, just tack onto that a little?
Of course you can.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, who's going to say no? So, like, I'm going to show my ignorance here, which is just, in my own personal life, I had so many friends in California who were Persian or Iranian, and I didn't understand how so much of Iran is liberal and modern, and yet fundamentalist religion has such power. And so I was wondering, and I've seen this a little bit. Like, I lived in Indonesia, I think the fourth largest country in the world, which had a very moderate form of Islam, but I watched fundamentalist Islam gain more and more political power. So I was wondering, do you see any direct, but building on what Leah said, do you think Israel's heading in the direction of theocracy? Just taking that down one notch, is Israel, are there other examples in the world from your comparative view that, like, we end up with very democratic modern people, but with an outsized influence of very theocratically oriented, um, I don't know what to say, influence?
Um, I can't think of a good case. I mean, obviously the Iranian case is, yeah, Rob Mickey says the Southern United States. Okay, I'll defer to him on that because he's an expert on that. Yeah, I was actually going to say the U.S. is probably in the closest parallel in a lot of respects, because even though we don't have religious parties, because we don't have a system that encourages multiple parties, religious of a particular type of religious voter is central to one of the parties. It can't win a majority without them. It can't win a majority in the electorate. It can't win the presidency without them. So that gives them outsized influence.
But there's
No, I
nothing
guess
special about the political structure of Israel that's heading in that direction.
I don't think so. In fact, I will still come back to my bottom line point is that the model of proportional representation and parliamentarism guards against that in a way that if they had a majoritarian system, that is, if they had two big parties, one of them would be dominant all the time, and that would be the party of the right, which would rely on Haredi votes, and I think they would have even more influence than they have in the coalition system. To defend that point would take me a lot more than the few minutes that we've got left, but I mean, I'm pretty much convinced that, the Haredi parties have twice in the last 10 years, a little over 10 years, um, found themselves in the opposition because their demands were too big, and all it took was a small vote shift for a different coalition to be formed that left them out. And they've discovered they don't like being in the opposition. So I mean, yeah, they have a few bottom line issues, but they don't push that hard on anything else. And I think if you really meant theocracy, it would be like you'd have to turn everything over to them. Like you'd have to to consult Litzman, the leader of the one of the leaders of the UTJ Haredi party. You'd have to consult, Derry on everything, or the Council of Sages would it would be the equivalent, I guess, to the Guardian Council in Iran. And I mean, how would that come about? I mean, it's not something I worry about. I realize I don't live in Israel, and I have the luxury of saying this as an analyst, and I know people who worry about this, but I don't think so. I mean, it's not Iran, a dictatorship that was overthrown by a movement that was centered on, or yeah, I mean, the best organized part of the opposition to the Shah was the centered on a particular religious set of organizations. But no, I'm that's not my big worry. Maybe I'm just too optimistic.
No, that's what we needed tonight. So for, I really, I want to thank you. I mean, I couldn't have asked you. You've done exactly what I asked you to do, which is I wanted
Thanks.
to, I mean, I know that a lot of us have very strong emotions about what's happening, and it could be that democracy is burning in Israel. We don't know. But what I wanted was more context and more clarification about how Israel works, how it compares to other democratic systems, and to understand a little bit more about the details of what's going on, because I'm able to have moral outrage all on my own, but I'm not always able to have someone like you explain some of the details to me. And I know that there are people here on who know things that we didn't say. I mean, there's a lot of expertise within the congregation and within this community. So Matthew,
Well,
I'd
yeah,
like to thank you, and I know you have more to give and more to say, but I just want to thank
yeah.
you. I mean. To accept my call is also a big deal, because I don't think it's easy to talk about these topics. We have, and you were very good at saying, okay, I'm being a little bit more normative here, but I also want to, be more balanced here. So I want to thank you so much.